At 10:22 p.m. on March 16, 1962, the captain of a Lockheed Super Constellation that had been chartered by the United States military made a routine radio call indicating his position and not mentioning any problems. The plane, with 107 people on board, including 93 soldiers of the United States Army, was never heard from again. And exactly what happened to Flying Tigers Line Flight 739 is an enduring mystery of a tumultuous period that deserves to be remembered. The United States Army's Center of Military History describes the first campaign of the war, most properly called the Second Indochina War, but in the U.S. most well known as the Vietnam War, as beginning on March 15th, 1962. The center describes the era. During this period, direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict increased steadily, as U.S. trained Vietnamese pilots moved Vietnamese helicopter units into and out of combat. Ultimately, the United States hoped that a strong Vietnamese government would result in improved internal security and national defense. While the U.S. had had advisors in the Republic of Vietnam since November of 1955, 1962 saw their numbers grow substantially. The center explains. The number of U.S. advisors in the field rose from 746 in January 1962 to over 3,400 by June. The entire U.S. commitment by the end of the year was 11,000, which included 29 U.S. Army Special Forces detachments. Among those being sent, in fact scheduled to arrive just one day after the Center of Military History lists as the beginning of the campaign, called the Advisory Period, were 93 Army Rangers on a chartered flight originating at Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California. The San Francisco newspaper SF Gate explained in May of 2021. They were from all over the nation, not one particular unit, which has led historians to speculate that they were hand-picked for a special mission. The specific role that these men were intended to play remains unclear to this day. A 2022 edition of the newspaper The U.S. Sun explains that while its final destination was known, the reason behind its mission has never been disclosed, and even the families of those on board remain in the dark. While presumably participating in training troops of the Republic of the Army of Vietnam, there are reasons to suspect something more sensitive. For example, one of the Rangers, Specialist 4 Donald A. Sargent, had enlisted right out of high school. His niece told Detroit Channel 4 News in 2022. He had just turned 22 on January 13th of that year. He decided he was going to join the Army and see if he could venture out and get something good for his life. But his role in the Army was not typical. After once leaving the service, his niece explains, he was pulled back in on a special mission, hand-picked by President John F. Kennedy. An official report by the United States Civil Aeronautics Board describes the men as mainly highly trained electronics and communications specialists. SF Gate speculates that the group may have been tasked with creating a training film. A possibility the paper suggests is supported by a letter that one of the men had gotten from his commanding officer at the Army's Film Library Division. Although SF Gate also speculated that the mission may have been in support of CIA missions, such as wiretapping, spying, or propaganda. Some sources describe the flight as a secret reconnaissance mission. A clue to their role might come from the fact that 3 men on the flight were members of the South Vietnamese military, but their names and roles with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam have never been identified. It is unclear if the Rangers' mission might have affected what came next, but SF Gate reports that the Rangers were particularly fatalistic about the mission. Jane Wendell, daughter of Sergeant First Class John Wendell, told the paper, "The day my dad volunteered to go, he went to my mom and said, 'Mommy, I think I signed my death warrant.' I don't know what the military said in the briefing of this mission, but I've learned that several others said the same thing." Jennifer Kirk told Channel 4 News that her uncle had difficulty saying goodbye. He'd come back up and he said, "I just need one more hug. I just need one more hug and then I can go." So he would start down and then he came back for the 3rd time and just gave the biggest, longest hug and just said, "I gotta go. I don't know when I'll be back." The flight was chartered from the Flying Tiger Line. Flying Magazine wrote in 2022 that the line had been started after the Second World War by 10 former members of the famous Volunteer Air Group that had fought on behalf of the Chinese during the war. The Flying Tiger Line was primarily a cargo carrier, but the Civil Aeronautics Board explains the carrier was able to operate under a special exemption by the CAB that authorizes the carrier to engage in interstate, overseas, and foreign air transportation of persons and cargo, pursuant to contracts with any department of the military establishment. SF-Gate speculates that the use of the carrier was intentional, attempting to obfuscate the U.S. military's growing involvement in the conflict between North and South Vietnam. Instead of military aircraft ferrying over troops, they traveled on Flying Tiger's chartered planes, held by civilian pilots and served by civilian flight attendants. Call it a bit of plausible deniability, the paper writes. The plane was a Lockheed L-1049H Super Constellation, a lengthened version of the original Lockheed Constellation, designed in 1939 at the request of Howard Hughes, then majority owner of Transworld Airlines, who was seeking, Simple Flying Magazine explains, a revolutionary aircraft capable of comfortably shuttling 20 passengers and 6,000 pounds of cargo across the United States, offering commercial aviation's first coast-to-coast, non-stop service. The Constellation had served as a cargo and transport aircraft during the war under the designation C-69. The 18-foot-longer Super Constellation first flew in 1950 and entered service with Eastern Airlines in 1951. Among its many innovations, the C-1049 featured an air-conditioned cabin. With a crew of 5 and a wingspan of 123 feet, the H model was a good fit for the Flying Tiger line, as it was convertible between a cargo and passenger version. This particular aircraft, tail number N6921C, serial number 4817, had been manufactured in May of 1957. The CAB report writes that as far as can be determined, the aircraft, engines, and propellers had been maintained as prescribed and were within their time limitations. The plane had an experienced crew of 7, owing to the long distance of the flight. The captain was 48-year-old Gregory P. Thomas, a Flying Tiger Line employee and experienced pilot with more than 19,500 hours of flying time, 3,562 of which were on the Lockheed 1049H. He held a first-class medical certificate and had a proficiency check on the 1049H the previous December. The rest of the crew was experienced as well. 48-year-old First Officer Robert J. Wish had logged more than 17,500 flight hours. 39-year-old Second Officer Robert Gazeway had logged 5,500 flight hours. The flight engineers, 38-year-old George M. Now and 33-year-old Clayton McClellan, and navigators, 45-year-old William T. Kennedy and 35-year-old Grady R. Burt, also had significant flight experience and valid medical certificates. The plane departed from Travis Air Force Base at 5:45 Greenwich Mean Time on the 14th. According to the manifest, no cargo was loaded aside from the passengers' personal baggage, and the CAB reports notes, the loading and departure of the aircraft at Travis Air Force Base was conducted normally and in accordance with Military Air Transport Service and Flying Tiger Line operating procedures. After a 12-hour flight, the plane arrived for its first fueling stop in Honolulu, where the plane received minor maintenance to the ignition systems on engines number 1 and 3. The flight also experienced a delay over a complaint by one of the stewardesses over adequate crew rest facilities that resulted in an additional mattress being placed on the deck beneath the lower bunk. The plane departed Honolulu at 20:40 hours GMT. The plane arrived at its next stop, Wake Island, at 03:54 GMT on the 14th. More maintenance, including replacing coils, leads, and spark plugs, was done on the ignition system, and the 4 stewardesses were replaced. The new crew, cabin attendants Patricia Wassam, Hildegard Mueller, Barbara Jim Wansley, and Crystal Diane Ryder, had, the CAB report notes, completed training procedures on the L-1049H emergency equipment and ditching procedures. Departing Wake at 05:15, the plane proceeded to its next stop, Guam, landing at 11:14. To this point, the flight had been normal. The CAB report noted that no mechanical discrepancy had been noted and no maintenance was required. The takeoff weight, after a stop of 1 hour, 33 minutes, was 132,554 pounds, well below the maximum allowable gross weight and within the prescribed center of gravity limits of the aircraft. The next leg of the trip to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines was scheduled to take 6 hours and 19 minutes, and the plane carried 9 hours and 30 minutes worth of fuel. The weather was generally good, and the forecast prepared for the flight did not anticipate any significant turbulence at the planned cruising altitude. Nothing seemed to be amiss. A later investigation of maintenance records found that N6921C was properly certified and in airworthy condition, that all inspections had been performed within the approved time limitations, and all airworthiness directives had been complied with. The plane departed Guam at 12:57. Radar contact was established with the Guam Air Traffic Control Center. And as was normal, radar contact was terminated after Flight 739 was 100 miles from Guam. Normal radio contacts were made over the course of the hour and a half after takeoff. At 14:22 hours, the flight contacted Guam, reporting their position. The crew estimated reaching Clark Air Force Base in approximately 5¼ hours and reported having 8 hours and 12 minutes of fuel remaining. The CAB report notes no indication of difficulty was given in this or any of the previous messages. Guam had some difficulty with radio static over the next hour, but attempted to contact Flight 739 again at 15:39 hours for its 15:30 status report. Despite numerous attempts, the CAB report notes, radio contact could not be established. In fact, the report writes, continuous attempts by all stations and aircraft in the area to contact the flight were unsuccessful. Guam reported the plane to be in uncertainty phase at 1600 hours, alert phase at 1633, and at 1943, when they did not arrive in Manila, the status was changed to distress. At that point, search and rescue operations were instituted at both Guam and Manila. At 22:27 hours, when the plane's fuel would have been exhausted, it was officially declared lost. N6921C had simply vanished sometime after the report at approximately 10:30 p.m. local time. The subsequent search, the CAB report notes, was one of the most extensive ever conducted in the history of aviation. It covered 144,000 square miles, included 1,300 people, 48 aircraft, and 8 surface vessels led by the U.S. Navy destroyer escort, USS Brister. The search included 377 air sorties, encompassing 3,471 flying hours over 8 days. To no avail. The report concludes, despite the thoroughness of the search, nothing was found which could be conceivably linked to the missing aircraft or its occupants. Air Force Major General Theodore R. Milton told the press, "The chances of finding any survivors now are about 1 in infinity." The sole clue to the fate of Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 was a report by the crew of a Liberian-flagged oil tanker operated by Standard Oil Company, the SSTL Linzen. The Linzen crew reported that they had seen what they described as a mid-air explosion at 15:30 hours GMT, approximately the time that the flight had first failed to report in. The crew reported seeing a vapor trail that, as it passed into a cloud, there occurred an explosion, which was described by witnesses as intensely luminous, while a white nucleus surrounded by a red and orange periphery with radial lines of identically colored light. 2 objects appeared to fall from the sky, and the ship's radar caught a small, bright target as the objects descended. The captain directed the boat to the presumed location where the object should have crashed and searched for 5½ hours, but no signals or unusual sightings were reported. With no other evidence, the CAB board concluded that the phenomenon witnessed by the crew of the TL Linzen was most likely N6921C in the process of demolishment. The report came to a disappointing conclusion. A summation of all relevant factors tends to indicate that the aircraft was destroyed in flight. However, due to the lack of any substantiating evidence, this board is unable to state with any degree of certainty the exact fate of N6921C. Relatives were sent a telegram stating that their loved one had been a passenger aboard a chartered aircraft that was reported missing while in flight. And a month later, a letter from Major General J.C. Lambert, the Adjutant General of the U.S. Army, stating, "All reports of debris sighted were investigated, but nothing was found that could be remotely associated with the plane." The search by sea and air was of such an intensity and thoroughness that it can be conclusively stated that debris and survivors from the plane did not exist. Consequently, after a full review and consideration of all available evidence, it has been concluded that for an unknown reason, the plane plunged into the sea with all its passengers. Among the possibilities considered was sabotage. The CAB report found that the plane had been left at ramp areas at all 3 stops that could be accessed without challenge, and that the aircraft had been left unattended in a dimly lit area for a period in Guam. But without debris, the theory of sabotage could not be proven. Mechanical error also was possible, although any such failure must have happened suddenly and without warning to the crew. The disappearance of an airplane carrying 107 souls, including 93 Army Rangers, is one of the most enigmatic and unexplained mysteries of the Vietnam era. To this day, nothing, no wreckage, no human remains, not even an oil slick has been found that can be tied to Flying Tigers Line Flight 739. In the absence of evidence, family members have been left to wonder. Was it mechanical error, or could it have been sabotage? Might they have been hijacked or had landed somewhere and been taken prisoner? Could it even have been an instance of friendly fire? Family members in frustration have complained at the military's unwillingness to even recognize their loss. A bill to have the 93 Rangers' names added to the Vietnam Memorial that was introduced in 2021 never made it out of committee. One family member told a newspaper in frustration, it's almost as if they didn't exist as soldiers, as if they don't matter, as if their deaths don't matter. In May of 2021, with the assistance of the nonprofit organization Wreaths Across America, a memorial was dedicated to 107 victims of Flying Tigers Line Flight 739 in Columbia Falls, Maine. Why not make 2024 a bucket list year? Whether that means going someplace different or meeting new people or just doing something out of the ordinary, there's no better way to do that than by scheduling a trip. So why not take a trip with the History Guy? It's a great way to meet other lovers of history and to get to know yours truly, the History Guy. And we have a great trip going June 15th to the 20th to the United Kingdom, where we're going to do all sorts of fun things, from exploring London neighborhoods to going down to the historic Cotswolds and Burton-on-the-Water. We'll do clay pigeon shooting and get archery training, and there's even an optional private cocktail tasting session. What better way is there to experience the history and culture of this island, this realm, this England, than by taking a trip with the History Guy? And now's the perfect time to sign up when the year is new and your schedule hasn't filled yet. And by the way, there's still a few early bird slots available that you can get at a discount. So fulfill that New Year's resolution to make 2024 a great year and sign up today. The link is in the description. I look forward to meeting you. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.